principal thing which Reich found the most interesting, of course, was the Trobriand tradition of creating not just huts, but basically children's villages. And the children's villages are very poorly understood by particularly Western thinkers. It's assumed that these are, places where kids go off to play doctor. They don't. These are literally satellite villages that are supported by the adults, basically only to the extent that the adults make sure they're safe, physically, and are given food, enough food, to sustain themselves. Beyond that, the attitude is largely do what you want to do, learn what you have to learn, and then when you're ready, come back and you become an adult member. Basically, it's determined by rites of passage into adult membership around basically what we call reproductive and productive maturity. At a certain point, you're able to not only have sex, but now you have responsibilities. With the privilege comes responsibility, and you also have to become more productive. Before that, you can play, explore, and facilitate your interest in all aspects of sexuality, including homosexual exploration, and basically what would roughly in psychoanalytic terms be is a complete opening up to what we call polymorphous perversity. In the children's villages, everything goes. So you can have multiple sexual partners, you can experiment homosexually, you can experiment in group sex, there are periods where there are openly encouraged orgies, and this involves children not only from prepubescent, but we're talking about even very young children. The actual ages of when children enter the children's villages vary, but usually by 6. Usually earlier than that, probably not, but very often from descriptions that earlier than that, the younger children tended to be in on, around, and curious, and nobody, they would be teased or sort of told to get away, like your younger sibling, like stop bothering us.
What's a good source for this, Harry?
Well, basically the best source, of course, is to read, which most people don't. Read The Sex Life of the Savages. He describes it pretty, he describes it accurately. His comments on that, Malinowski's comments on that, which Reich also drew a lot of his insight for the developing of the imposition of compulsory sex morality, is Malinowski's lesser known critique about psychoanalysis and the issue of the Oedipus complex, is a book called Sex and Repression in Savage Society. A book which the psychoanalytic community savaged, literally. I mean, went after brutally. Freud, we know from correspondence, specifically told Ernst Jones and others to attack Cesar Roheim, who was the anthropological, psychoanalytic, driving force, was literally ordered to savage and go after Malinowski's work, and Malinowski was drummed out. The book, by the way, is very, very pro-psychoanalysis. He just raises some very interesting questions about whether the Oedipus complex would really exist in a culture where there was no need to have it, and that respect. When we look at what Reich did not have available was the later work in the 60s and 70s on hunters and foragers. When we look at Kung and other groups, the original Tutsi groups before what happened in Uganda, when we look at these groups, right, you see actively no differentiation between childhood and adult sexuality, except around the fact that among Kung, for instance, when children are seen having coitus, and they do, they describe 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, basically having sexual, contact. The standard joke is that all the adults laugh, and sort of like the way we see kids doing things precociously, we say, "Oh, isn't that cute?" But of course, you can't really do it. So, try, but too bad. You'll have to wait, until you can really do it. But it's not with any kind of malicious or negative intent. It's simply, it's not. You're not old enough really to do what we do, but keep trying. Practice will make perfect. So I guess in the Woody Allen tradition. Maybe. Anyway, so you begin to see that. At the same time, the issue of what happens to these natural, social, and cultural environments, which tend to be just reflexive. In other words, in nature, humans organize their social organization not to dominate nature, but to respond to nature, what nature gives you. So if you don't have a lot of water, you organize around how you get water. If you have a lot of water, you organize how you deal with the fact that you have too much water. You know, I mean, and so on and so forth. What that will lead to eventually is humans in nature developing natural social organizations, or groups, societies, usually as a result of increased population growth, right? Developing constructs, right, that lead to what I call armored social constructions of the organism through cultural imposition. In other words, you begin to set up what Reich comes to call the great, no, you don't do that. We don't do it that way. No, that's not good. That's not right. That's not acceptable. Right? This is the way we do it. This is good. That's bad. Right? That kind of development is quite late. Right? I mean, part of what this doesn't, I think, reflect is the timeline. So they might well be, if I will eventually develop. So, in another regard, these developments happen historically, or in terms of time, at different times. You begin to see the emergence of what number 7, or armored social constructions, much later. And Reich was misled. I mean, the archaeological and anthropological evidence was still very early at the time that Reich was beginning to be sensitive to this, and Malinowski was working. You have to understand that anthropology really only emerged as a serious science, and the level of ethnographic accuracy only began to become available really by around 1890. Franz Boas begins to do some serious work, and others. And Malinowski is working in the early, the beginning of the 20th century and the early, 1900s in terms of the groundbreaking work. So there wasn't that much available. The 50s and 60s produced a huge explosion of material at the same time that all these societies are basically disappearing. But that said, the time frame here is that probably Reich thought that this had been a process that had gone on for possibly 10,000 years or so. In fact, probably the earliest stages of the beginning of 7, or the armored social construction, can probably be pushed back to about 30,000, 40,000 years ago. And that prior to that, one of the interesting comments that Richard Lee, who's a very fine Marxist anthropologist, as he likes to call himself, and physical anthropologist as well as cultural anthropologist, points out, is that on a timeline, humans in nature emerge approximately based on the most conservative dating about 1,400,000 years ago. Right? For the first 1,000,000 and probably 350,000 years, it remains stable, small, and consistent groups in very stable, small, consistent pockets. A population well under 1,000,000, probably closer to around 100,000. Right? And then all of a sudden, so you have two theories here. It's either outer space travel has arrived and seeded the planet, or something happened. Reich has some interesting thoughts on that. He has the dating wrong, but basically, around 50,000 years ago, which is virtually no time at all, population explodes. And it begins to explode, geometrically, not arithmetically.
Well, it also begins to spread.
But the spread is probably directly related to the explosion of population size. There have been some interesting computer simulations. I'd like to point out, in nature, and this is also interesting, in nature, humans human females have approximately 21 pregnancies in their fertility cycle. Okay? And my students often will say, 21 babies? No, 21 pregnancies, which means and interestingly, we know now that pregnancy, on average, in nature, doesn't usually become viable until the females are approximately what we would call the age of 20, which is interesting. Right? So you've got this long period of time in which girls are having sex, but not getting pregnant.